The latest edition of FIFA, the multi-million-dollar game franchise, FIFA 17 is here, which can only mean one thing: it's time to build a PC, but not just one for FIFA 17, a compact form factor, living room gaming PC that fits under a budget price point. Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video, and as you gauged from the intro, today I'm going to be building a PC to play FIFA 17 on insane settings, at high frame rates, while staying in the confines of a reasonable budget. If you haven't seen part 1, where I go over the part selection, hit the cards button at the top right and go and watch, but this is part 2, so it's time to teach you how to build it. The first step is to grab a Phillips head screwdriver and clear a workspace. Get your components and parts in a group and follow along with me. I'd recommend watching this once through before following along, but let's get into it and start with case prep. With this being a mini ITX case, there are a few quirks. Firstly, unscrew the power supply holder from the rear of the case, identifying the top. Take your power supply and screw it into the bracket. Don't put the bracket in yet, just leave this PSU and bracket assembly to one side, you will need it later. Next, take the I/O shield from the motherboard. This is the metal plate that labels all the ports. Clip it into the rectangular cutout at the back of the case and clip in the 4 corners. The writing and any colours should face the outside of the case, and the headphone and audio port on the left hand side when looking at the case from the rear. Now grab the 4 brass standoffs that come in the bag with your case. These raise your motherboard above the metal housing of the case to stop it from grounding out. Whilst Cooler Master don't pre-install the standoffs, they do include a tool which allows you to install them with a Phillips head screwdriver. Mini ITX motherboards, being the smallest, only take 4 screws, 1 at each corner. The screw holes are in the case for us under the power supply area. Simply align the brass standoffs and tighten using the tool. That's it, the case prep is now out of the way. Time for the motherboard assembly. Take the CPU, in this case AMD's Athlon X4 860K. Pull up the arm on the socket and align the golden triangle on the CPU with that other plastic one on the motherboard. The golden pins on the bottom of the CPU are very fragile, so don't touch these. These will slot down into the holes on the motherboard socket. Then pull down the retention arm and that's it. Don't force it, and the CPU should be flush to the socket prior to pulling the arm down. Now it's RAM time. In this case I'll be using 8GB of crucial RAM. Find the notch in the RAM and align it with the notch on this Gigabyte ITX motherboard. Unclip the clips on the RAM DIMM slots and slot the RAM in. Apply even pressure to each side, preferably using both hands, and that's it once again. It will clip in and the 2 clips go under the notches at the sides of the RAM. I'd like to take a moment to thank the companies that made this possible. First off is Asus, who sent over their RX 470 for review and feature in this build guide, and as with everything I'll leave links to that in the description, so a huge thank you to them. Secondly, I'd like to thank Cooler Master, who sent over the Elite 130 case and Sinon 120 V3 liquid cooler. Once again, links to both the products on Amazon and to the reviews in the description below. I'd also like to thank GeekaByte, who were kind enough to send over their A88X motherboard and FM2 Plus board housing our CPU. And finally to Crucial, who sent over some RAM a little while back that I'm using in this video. But let's get back to the tutorial. Make sure to check those links out in the description below. But let's get back to the video and move on to the CPU cooler. We need to install this before we install the motherboard into the case, as we need access to the back of the board. Take the CPU cooler, and I hate to say it, but you will need to look at Cooler Master's manual for this one. The CPU of CPU coolers varies on a socket to socket basis. For FM2 Plus we need to flip the backplate, this large metal piece, to the AMD side. Next take the screws, the ones with completely blank unscrewable heads. Slot these through the appropriate holes as instructed in the manual and slide the little black plastic stoppers over. Remove the existing mounting hardware, just these 2 plastic bits of the motherboard, and the existing backplate on the motherboard will pop off. Slot the 4 screws that we just installed on the back plate through the now apparent holes on the motherboard. Take the appropriate brackets, once again as instructed in the CPU cooler instructions, and screw these into the CPU block. Grab the tube of thermal paste which came with your cooler and syringe the same amount as a grain of rice on your CPU. This will be the link between the CPU and the plate on the CPU cooler. You want enough to effectively conduct heat between the two, but any more than this will lead to poorer performance and unnecessary spillage.
That's what she said!
Take the CPU block and place it through the 4 screws, the ones sticking out of the motherboard. The CPU cooler comes with nuts. Screw these onto the top of the screw over the CPU cooler, tightening them in a diagonal cross pattern. Make sure these are tight enough for the CPU block to be secure, and that's it. But if there's any problems, please do refer to the manual, as this does vary on a CPU cooler, socket to socket, CPU to CPU basis. Now we need the screws that look like this, 4 of them to be precise, to screw the motherboard in. Take this slow as the CPU cooler and radiator are attached. The motherboard I/O needs to be first slotted through the I/O shield at the back of the case. Try not to put unnecessary strain on the radiator of the CPU cooler. You may be able to rest this on a part of the case for now. The motherboard holes on each corner should then be lined up for the brass standoffs. You may need to push it through the I/O shield and hold it there in order to screw these in. Take the screws from a moment ago and screw them through the hole in the motherboard to the brass standoffs. As before, do this in a diagonal cross pattern to ensure everything's as tight as one another and no over tightening happens. Now we need to screw the radiator in. Take the front panel off the case. You may need to add a little bit of force, but this should pop right off. There are 4 plasticky screws that go through the fan and the case at the front. We won't be using this fan or those screws, so take those out and remove the fan. Next, take one of the radiator fans that came with the CPU cooler and one of the long screws with a thumb grip at the end, which came included with the CPU cooler, and hold the fan on the front of the radiator. These screws will not only install the fan to the radiator, but also install the radiator into the case, and this is the fan that's going in between the radiator and the front panel of the case. Take the other included fan and the same screw type as before and screw that into the back. The angle of the tubes and the water block may need adjusting, but routing tubes is fairly simple. Remember, the power supply will mount it above the water block so the tubes cannot intrude into that area. At the front where we've installed those screws, make sure they go through properly, the bracket on the front of the case, and are nice and secure. Next up, we're going to plug in some of the wiring before it all gets cramped and tricky. Take the fan leads and plug them into the fan headers on the motherboard. They look like this. Next, grab the motherboard manual and go to the page labelled front panel connectors. These are small cables for the power and reset switches, hard drive activity LED and power LED. These go on the pins on the motherboard. Ensure the positive end is going to the positive pins and the negative connectors to the negative ones. Don't panic, however, if it doesn't go quite right, nothing's going to blow up. You'll just have to go back and redo this bit. You probably won't use all the pins either. Now take this HD audio connector and plug it into this connector. It has a pin blocked out and will only go in one way. So once again, don't force it. It's the same case for USB 2. Take the connector and plug it into a connector on the motherboard. That looks like this. Finally, for USB 3, this is the largest of our connectors so far and is keyed. So once again, we'll only go in one way. There is a pattern occurring here. Do not force this either. Installation is simple. It clips in like any other cable ever. Next up is the power supply. Just to recap, we've done the RAM, CPU, motherboard, case, prep some wiring and installed the CPU cooler. We've already installed the PSU into the housings, which is as simple as feeding the power supply cables through and screwing the bracket into the back of the case using the same screw type as those used to attach the shield to the power supply. Ensure the side marked top is in fact at the top, and I would recommend having the power supply fan face into the case to act as an exhaust from air pulled in by our intake fans at the front, creating kind of an air tunnel. You may also need to install some extra cables to the PSU, in this case a GPU power cable and SATA power harness for our hard drive. Add these into the appropriate connectors on the power supply and move these to the side. Now the biggest connector of all, the 20+4 pin motherboard power connector. This has 8 pins seen as squares on the end of the connector and powers the motherboard along with different bits and bobs connected to it. Next is the 4+4 pin CPU header. This powers the CPU and is plugged into the motherboard. Some motherboards will take 8 pins, 2 of the 2 4-pin blocks. This one, however, only takes 1. It's as simple as taking either of the 2 4-pin blocks and plugging them in. It is advisable to tuck extra cable slack away or use the cable ties to tuck the cables up somewhere. Next, take a SATA cable that looks like this, and we'll use this to connect to our hard drive to our motherboard for the transfer of data. Leave the other connector loose at the moment. That's going to be used later on once we get around to installing the hard drive. We will just plug in one end in for now to the motherboard while we can before things get even more cramped. Next up is the GPU, and screw the bracket here. This is where the GPU I/O will go. Push the notch on the PCI slot down and align the PCB of the GPU with the slot. It's as simple as pushing it down. The I/O should go nicely where we just remove the bracket, and the retention clip on the PCI slot will pop back up. Now align it with the screw holes on the top of the brackets and screw the GPU in with the thumb screws. Whilst these are called thumb screws, I would recommend taking a screwdriver to these to make sure they're nice and tight. Take the 6-pin GPU power cable, the only 6-pin connector here, it's one group of 6, one of the modular cables included with the power supply, and clip it into the GPU. This will give our GPU the extra power that it needs. All that's left to do now is the installation of our hard drive. You'll need this rubber washer and 2 SSD screws provided in the bag labelled SSD screws, along with 2 hard drive screws. The 2 hard drive screws will go in the bottom of the drive with the SSD screws in the side. I'll be mounting this hard drive in the optical drive area for easiness, but this case does give extra options. Take the 2 rubber washers and slot these into the hard drive slots on the optical cage. Line the hard drive holes up and screw in. These screws on the side should now be lined up, so screw these in also. Take the other end of the SATA data cable and clip that into the data connection. It will only go in one way, so once again, don't force it. Finally, we need to install a SATA power cable, another modular cable for our PSU, and this doesn't give a satisfying click when it goes in, so a bit more pressure will need to be applied. Just don't force it. But that's all. Screw it in, screw the outer panel back on and relax. Sorry. Your Beast PC is now built. You'll need a copy of Windows, and like everything else, I'll link it in the description below. I do hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you did, I would urge you to drop a like rating down below. It just bumps this up in like search rankings and that kind of thing. And please do subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. Once again, a huge thank you to the people that helped make this possible. Asus, Cooler Master, GeekaWhat, and Crucial, who sent over some stuff a little while back. Please note that the links in the description below, the Amazon links, are affiliate links, meaning a small commission is made by me from those links. Just something I wanted to mention in aid of transparency. But as always, we will see you in the next GeekaWhat video.